If you've read this video's title and thumbnail text, you might be a little confused by the contradicting doublespeak, but it isn't clickbait. I mean both statements with the utmost sincerity. Tokyo Xanadu is Falcom's worst title, well, at least modern Falcom's, but it's still a really good video game despite that, even if it desperately tries to convince you otherwise. Now, that may also sound a bit odd, but it will make sense by the end of this video. For starters, this is less of a review and more of a PSA to give you some sort of idea of what you might be in for with Tokyo Xanadu when the Switch version comes out at the end of this month. This is because if I was the sort of channel that did put scores on games, I'd say that Tokyo Xanadu barely scrapes by into the 7 out of 10 territory, but this comes with the caveat that some parts are far below a 7, while other parts are a good deal above, making it a game that's a bit rough to get into, but well worth it once you do. Let's reel things back a little bit. Tokyo Xanadu was a game that originally came out on the PlayStation Vita in 2015 with a enhanced PS4 port dubbed EX Plus that came out a year later. It's a severe rebranding of an old dungeon crawler series that over the years has had a couple of somewhat well-known releases. This new version throws out the old school dark and grungy medieval theme for a modern day Tokyo setting and the knights and mages with superpowered high schoolers. On a surface level, it may look like a action RPG ripoff of Persona with all of the trimmings such as social links and the like, and that's because honestly it kinda is. Due to the timing of its release lining up with a bunch of new talent at Falcom and a bunch of obvious examples of reused code and assets from Trails of Cold Steel, it's widely speculated that this was a bit of a throwaway game for the new devs at the studio to cut their teeth on, and so Falcom could see where each new member excelled. There's a lot of people who see this as a knock on the game, as its scope and budget is definitely less than that of the Trails and East series because of this. But personally, I think it's a nice change of pace for the studio. It can't be ignored, however, that it is kind of obvious that Tokyo Xanadu is trying to desperately punch above its weight class, and the cracks do start to show. However, quite a few of these are a bit misleading, and this is where the early game, for whatever reason, does a really good job at trying to trick you into thinking the game is worse than it is. Starting with the cast and story, at first glance the characters and plot feel painfully cliche and generic, but in a weird way, it feels like it might be by design. See, by introducing characters like the angsty protagonist, the tsundere prodigy girl, and the delinquent with a heart of gold, they're able to play around these tropes as the game goes on. And what they end up doing is taking these, what feel like painfully generic characters, and play around with them in fun ways and really subvert your expectations with quite a few of them. I think this is a pretty cool idea, but it comes at the cost of the first chunk of the game being really pulled down by these negative expectations being set up in the first place. The protagonist Ko is the best example of them doing it right, since they don't really drag out the reveal of his character traits too much, and he does get the most screen time from second one. His design and his general aloof nature at first glance comes across as your typical angsty emo teenager protagonist who everybody thinks is cool despite him being this incredibly antisocial loser with no direction in his life. However, very quickly we learn that this first impression is quite deceiving, as he's actually a workaholic who's juggling multiple part-time gigs to both pay for his accommodation as well as his just wanting to help small-town businesses in the local area. He's actually a very likable, down-to-earth character, and his constant gloomy demeanor is constantly made fun of by his friends and even himself, as there's a few times throughout the story where he's like, damn, I kinda look like an idiot right now. Ko is definitely the most extreme example of how they did this, but pretty much the entire cast uses this similar style of writing, and it's really refreshing to see such overused tropes being written in a really natural and realistic way. It's something that you really need to keep in mind, however, since first impressions are paramount and a lot of the cast are really nothing special until you start to dig deeper. Luckily, however, the first impressions of the characters are nowhere near as bad of that of the gameplays. In fact, the second and third impressions of the gameplay are nothing to sneeze at either. Now, the gameplay is a action RPG system, and if you've played the E-series, you'll know that Falcom aren't great at creating a fast-paced, arcadey-like flow to their action RPGs. However, while I feel like the newer Ys games like Ys 8 and 9 can feel a tad loose and slippery at times, Tokyo Xanadu actually has the opposite problem of feeling a little bit too rigid and stiff. It's like comparing animations from something like Guilty Gear or Marvel vs. Capcom to animations from Mortal Kombat. This is probably due to it being built on the same engine as Trails of Cold Steel, and they're very clearly trying to rework code built for a turn-based game into one for an action-based dungeon crawler, and it's not a perfect conversion. By itself, however, this wouldn't really be much of a problem. Like, sure, it is a bit of a blemish on the game, but it's still pretty fun and really good in short bursts like the game presents it to you. Where the issues start to arise is that the game really only just has enough going on for it to be engaging, and unfortunately those mechanics take roughly 3 or 4 chapters to slowly be drip-fed to you. The prologue gives you nothing to work with other than a single basic attack string and a projectile that is tied to a stamina bar, along with 2 characters that you can switch on the fly. Chapter 1 introduces your big super attack that you'll be able to use twice per dungeon if you're lucky. Chapter 2 introduces a flying dash attack that uses that same stamina bar, and if you're playing the enhanced EX Plus version, we'll get to that later, you'll also get access to your EX skills, which are kind of like a smaller super attack that you'll actually be able to use here and there while you're playing. And then in Chapter 3, it introduces a stamina using power attack that is slow but does a lot of damage, as well as the X-Drive system, where you can temporarily summon a teammate to assist you like the Ice Climbers in Smash Bros, which, like the super attack, is something you don't get to use often. That's like 10 to 15 hours to go from 2 combat tools to 8, but realistically, 2 of them you'll only be getting to use every so often. Now, I don't mind simple combat here and there, especially if the game has other stuff going for it, and since it's not too input intensive, I do quite get a kick out of trying to maintain a combo throughout each stage. And there's stuff like a perfect dodge mechanic that helps reward riskier, higher level play if you choose to engage with it. But when you have to build up to that level of simplicity from practically nothing, it makes the game feel dull as doornails for the first 20-25% of it, and that really puts a lot of people off. Especially when there's not too much indication of just how much you're locked out of in the beginning, meaning a good number of players will probably quit before it quote-unquote gets good. Luckily, while the combat may seem like the core gameplay on the surface level, which is definitely not a good look when it's the weakest element of the game, it's arguably not the main draw. See, like Persona, the combat portions are sandwiched between stuff like social sim elements and city exploration, and this is really good since Falcom really excels at character writing. And due to their love of putting way too much effort into writing their random NPCs, it means that if you want and you really put the time into it, you can kind of turn it into a bit of a visual novel, just one with extra steps. And scouring the city for extra conversations, side quests, and all that sort of stuff is where the game really makes up for its kinda lackluster combat, and this is especially true with the EX Plus version, adding a bunch of extra bonding events and mini-games that really help flesh out those characters even more than before, and also just add some really nice pace breakers here and there. What's more, the English version in particular of the EX Plus port is very important, and soon with the Switch release it will become even more so. As I mentioned before, the EX Plus version does add a few little things here and there, like the optional bonus bonding events and the new combat mechanic in the EX skills, but it also adds a ton of extra content to the core game as well. There's now these special Gaiden chapters that are sort of sandwiched between the normal ones. They're not as long cutscene wise, and there's no side quests or town exploration really going on, but they're fairly substantial and even include some extra new playable characters for for the game. And what they also do is foreshadow and set up for a epilogue chapter that extends the ending past where the original game left off, and even sets up for a sequel that we'll probably see in Japan next year. There is an argument to be made that these additions stretch out the game's pacing a bit and make it a bit more long-winded than it needs to be, but I think that the added content really justifies the extended runtime. What makes the English version of EX Plus particularly important though is that unlike the original version, it's actually got a completed translation. The original localization on the Vita was rife with problems like grammatical and syntax errors, and in some cases dialogue was just untranslated or was a garbled mess, and it never got patched. Luckily, thanks to the few extra months it took to get the EX Plus port out in the West, it meant that the localization was cleaned up a little bit more. It's not amazing, but it's definitely passable, even if it does have a ton of quirks like the famous Falcom sentence opener of haha being translated as just chortle. This, however, is where the new Switch port comes into play, since Axis has actually decided to retranslate the whole thing with a new team at the helm. And this crew is one we know we can trust, as many of them are dedicated Falcom fans coming from the Geofront fan translation team that brought us the exceptionally good translations of Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure. Needless to say, I think with this Switch port, it will arguably be the definitive edition of this game, since I don't think that Axis Games are patching the new translation into the PC or PS4 version. Luckily, originally being a Vita game means that the Switch can handle it just fine. Obviously, I don't own the game yet, but looking at the Japanese gameplay footage and doing some pixel counting, I can tell you that the game is running at a native 1080p 60, with the only things that it seems to be missing from the base PS4 version is some anti-aliasing and maybe some anisotropic filtering on the textures. It's definitely possible that there may be more taxing areas later on with certain boss fights that can cause the frame rate to dip, but I think for the most part it's gonna run fine. You're really only losing a slightly cleaner image compared to the other versions, and if you've got something like an M Classic, you can definitely smooth those jaggies out a bit. Either way, I do hope the other versions do get patched, but it's not the end of the world if they don't. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. I wanted to just do a recommendation for Tokyo Xanadu since the new version's coming out, and I really do think people should go and pick it up because it's a really good game. At least it is to anybody who can get past that first really bad hurdle. And I just wanted to pre-warn a lot of people before they get there, because it's definitely a problem, but it's just a really charming game, and also a very nice change of pace for Falcom, who've only really been doing East and Trails for the last 10 plus years. It's just nice to see them do something different, and with a Tokyo Xanadu 2 on the horizon, that may very well fix a lot of these issues that the game has. It'll be good to have this game under your belt for Tokyo Xanadu 2 when that game's hype cycle starts coming about and everybody's going, can I start with this game or do I need to play the previous one? Either way, that's about it. If you're still watching, thank you for watching this far, and sorry for the lack of content this last month and a half. I've just been pretty busy and away from my computer, but while I've been away, I have been working on scripts, and I've got 2 in reserve that I just need to record, so hopefully, content should be pretty quick again for the next month or so. Until then, I'll see you around.